Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from the European public interest law firm Frank Bold. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years of leading discussion about responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I lead our discussion of the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the international financial institutions, or IFIs, we all know that they are crucial to the world meeting sustainable development and climate goals, and that they've increasingly introduced social and environmental criteria into their lending. But how successful are they, and what implications does this have for business? Our focus is on the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, which has focused on Central and Eastern Europe and now wider, and which has already reached 50% of its work being in green finance and is already fully aligned with the Paris climate goals. Our guest to discuss this is Robert Adamczyk, Senior Environmental Advisor at EBRD. Robert, a very warm welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you very much, Richard, and I'm delighted to be in this new year with yourself and Frankly Speaking and joining Frank Bold. Thank you very much.
Now, you've been at EBRD for a little over 20 years, and so you've personally witnessed the sort of evolution that there's been with the IFIs bringing in more and more social and environmental criteria requirements. Give us a sort of overview of how you've seen the change occur over that time.
I actually had my first touch or work with the EBRD in 1993. I was training on financial intermediaries for EBRD, on consultants and how to support environmental, in those days it was only environmental policy, on the environmental journey. So the journey has been long, and EBRD is quite unique because we are a transition bank. So we were set up to help develop the private sector, develop the market economy, moving from centrally planned economies in Eastern Europe. So it had a very specific mandate on transition. And that transition was basically to ensure that, first of all, investment went into our countries of operations, which was, of course, Eastern Europe at that stage, and ensuring best practices at the same time, although the social wasn't as defined, it only came later, and stop eco-dumping, stop polluting industries from being developed in Eastern Europe, and actually helping to restructure and transform that industrial base into something which is more coherent. And of course, the success stories would have been Poland, failures we could say further east, unfortunately gone a different way. But the banks always looked at this environmental mandate to ensure that it's reputational, it's risk, liability issues. And that journey has gone from the side of reputational risk, liability, pollution, dealing with retrenchment, large number of restructuring. So actually job losses were quite big. So actually bringing more and more best practices, EU standards, and ensuring that the European Union environmental and social policies are applied, because these were countries of accession. So the EBRD is very closely linked to the EU environmental policy and EU acquis. And the social dimension. The social dimension started to come up really probably in the 2000s, more late 2000s, when it started to develop into its own right. The IFC developed, of course, the performance standards, our environmental performance requirements, now environmental and social requirements of the bank follow very much that same philosophy, and they were updated actually last year. But a very strong EU focus. So we actually do relate to EU legislation, we relate to EU standards, but only those standards where they can be applied at the project level, rather than looking at implementing the directive. So we're looking at ensuring the BAT is applied rather than the process, ensuring that
BAT, best available techniques.
Techniques, yes. So under the Industrial Emissions Directive, ensuring that the best available techniques are applied at that plant level, which is nearly 50,000 companies in Europe. And following our lead, the IFC has actually included that more or less as well. They actually have aligned, although not officially, but IFC as well, so the World Bank Group and the international IFIs are applying these best available techniques. Although in the EU, it's more defined. So ours would be a bit more defined. So it's looking at ensuring this transition. And for us, the journey has come from transforming into this market economy And as we have expanded, and of course, we always had Central Asia, we had the former Soviet republics. Turkey, then with the Arab Spring, came the North Africa and parts of the Middle East. And we are now expanding into the Sub-Saharan Africa as well, with new countries added this year, with Kenya. So that expansion is happening slowly, but surely. But it's still the core base is Eastern Europe and, of course, Ukraine, where we're still very active. And then we have actually invested over the past few years, 3 billion, to support existing clients. So that is going to maybe a separate discussion, how we support those areas.
We might come back to that.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, as you've talked about one big transition, which is the transition from post-communist, centrally planned economies to market economies, and to pursue that transition and then the environmental or the energy transition at the same time, two big transitions. Can you really do both? And what are the conflicts and the trade-offs that you found in trying to do so?
First of all, market economy is looking at what is efficient, and of course the efficiency of old industrial coal polluting industries, energy intensive industries had to be transformed. So that was a natural area where the environmental and energy efficiency was a hub and a key area of any of the transition, be it energy sector or the steel sector. Energy efficiency, looking at the district heating systems, was a key theme. And over the past 10 years, we've included more and more of the climate issues and climate ambitions of both the EU and, of course, eventually Paris Agreement, is to ensure that there's a transition on the decarbonization. So we actually removed financing about 10 years ago, over 10 years of coal. Moved away from that. In fact, our last coal-fired project was efficiency related in early 2010s. So we don't do coal. We moved away quite a lot from gas, unless it is necessary, because there are some instances still where gas is even part of the energy transition, necessary to balance the grid, to help with efficiencies of both the grid. But also in some industries for competitive needs, gas is still needed. And we need to look at the competitiveness of where we invest and where we have been investing. In some ways, that goes in line with some of the EU current themes, is that efficiency, competitiveness is key, and energy is key, and the transition away from highly intensive energy using industries, but also energy generation facilities, to more modern, and of course that's renewable energy.
And that point about still investing in fossil fuels, and this is less aimed at EBRD, but the other international financial institutions. The Climate Policy Initiative says 3/4 of energy investment by the IFIs is in fossil fuels, in companies which are still expanding their production. Now, I hear your answer there, that for competitiveness reasons, you can't just drop it all together, and our listeners will have heard that. But one more criticism from the Climate Policy Institute is that the IMF actually says that developing economies should be expanding fossil fuels to meet their debt repayments. So is there a bit of doublethink going on there? Are the international financial institutions still too far allowing fossil fuels to expand?
Well, I think there's two sides to the coin. First of all, unfortunately, the world is where we are in 2026, where certain changes are happening in international law as well. How it is being applied, I think, is being questioned. But we have, there's a number of areas. First of all, we as EBRD are a bit different than the IFIs, because we're very tailored. We're a regional bank focusing on the specific private sector areas and helping to develop the private sector. So we can walk away from deals. We are doing the best deals that there are in terms of the private sector, supporting developing of renewable projects. And of course, the environmental impacts of renewable projects need to be always in the social taken into account. So and our policy is quite clear. Now, do we do still some fossil fuels? Of course. And in Ukraine, for instance, we have projects where we will be doing fossil fuels because it is emergency, coming in with an emergency generators, which will tend to be gas, but might be multi-fuel. And that is because there is no alternative at this moment in time. And we need to support that, you could say, the survival of Ukraine, which we are doing. And that's a key area of our development. In other countries, we'll be looking at that transition and transformation. So we would always now look at the project transition in that balancing power. Nuclear will be an interesting area when I think we will have discussions more and more. Should the IFIs be involved and how should we be involved? We did do a lot of investments in 2014-15 in Ukraine on nuclear safety. But that's always safety and life extension go hand in hand. So this is an area where I think other IFIs have different criteria, and the World Bank will be under different pressure. So I can't speak for them, and I can't speak about the overall IFI in terms of where they are. So I'll ping pong that ball back.
It was a good try.
But EBRD, we definitely are on the path of trying to make that change, supporting those companies that are making the change, being at the forefront of also not only financing projects, but helping with institutional change and helping with the legislative change in terms of some of the tender processes. In Poland, we helped a lot with the legislation. There was a period where renewable energy was actually taken a back step, and the EBRD helped with our office in, of course, Warsaw, and we have regional office, to lobby to change, to allow to the government to as well eventually come and do a reverse cycle to start supporting renewable energy again. And without that lobbying support and being there for both investors and being there for the private sector clients, but also lobbying the government, maybe some of these transitions wouldn't go as fast, or there could be further derailed. So we see ourselves as a catalyst to help the private sector. We're helping the institutional strengthening, but changes in the legislation sometimes in terms of how the tariffs work, to look at the systematic approach. And as we have the chief economist office, we have an entire economist team that helps in that area. And then we make those projects happen on the ground with putting our conditionalities, which are environmental and social, to ensure that these projects are done well.
And what impresses me about EBRD, as an observer of your work, is that you are very much, you understand transition, and in terms of climate, you are definitely pushing transition, and that I think you provide an example to other development banks on that. Next question, though, is have you got enough money? And not just you, but all of the development banks, because at the COP 30 climate summit just before the end of last year, the development banks were once again reaffirmed as the key drivers and engines of climate transition. Many academics and studies have said there's still a huge chasm between the amount of money that is needed in the world to fulfill sustainability goals and the amount of money that's there. How do you respond to that?
I think it is, again, we have limitations in terms of financing and which regions we have, of course, different areas for different sectors, different project types, because as a bank, we have to manage our risk portfolio in that side, and of course, not invest in one country or invest too much in one sector. But in terms of financing, yes, there needs more. But on the other hand, there is a need for more projects. And just having the money, sometimes in some projects, you've got competition for good projects. The good projects will find financing. A good project, by definition, is good. There will be a queue of investors, and our philosophy, and actually a requirement, is that we're additional, i.e. we do not compete with the private sector. And if the private sector can do it, we actually reduce our mandate and reduce the volume, and sometimes even step away. That is an area where we have a problem. So actually, the bigger issue is, are there enough projects to be developed, and are they economically sound, and are they structured to make sure that they're bankable, i.e. feasible to finance? And that results in the tariffs, the requirements, working with governments to ensure that there is enough investment coming in. And that is also in terms of risk profiles. So you will have in Central Asia, you don't have that many international investors going in, and only a few big ones coming in, or the locals. So who do we support? We can't support all investors. We have a very strong integrity approach as well in terms of ensuring that we have sanctions, we have other areas. So who is actually the shareholders of those companies, but also the supply chains becomes a very important area where we look at ensuring that human rights is, of course, adhered to, but also environmental issues in the supply chain. area, which that narrows down some of the projects that we can be involved. So is there enough bankable projects that we can finance that have been structured in the right way, that meet the requirements of the IFIs as well? Because there's some projects we can't touch because of the supply chain, for instance, or that they're not structured well enough in terms of the environmental or social issues, in terms of livelihood loss or resettlement development. Is the infrastructure there? And this is an area where we work as well. Are the grid systems adequately developed? And the grid system development in many countries is a big problem to ensure that we can develop the renewable projects. It is also making sure that we can, in the energy side particularly, but also in terms of industry, is the industry side in the right area, or agriculture, how we can support. So it is not as an easy question as could be asked, is there enough finance? Because we can raise, and we are raising finance. And I think the EBRD as well is unique. We don't use, you could say, we're taxpayer funded because that's the seed capital, but we borrow on the markets. So we actually use that money. We don't use taxpayers' money for their investments. We actually borrow that money on the market. And then refinance, invest. We have a very strong treasury that actually then raises the capital based on what we have been provided by our shareholders, which are governments. And that's a different, again, concept compared to some other IFIs where we're not using the taxpayers' money or donor. We actually are raising money on the markets, investing, and it needs to be also profitable at the end of the day to pay that back. So we're looking at the margins at the same time and being competitive in those markets where we invest, and we want to invest in the private sector, which is 80% of our investment. So the question here is, I think, how do we facilitate that there are more projects? How do we ensure that the governments have the right policies to support the private sector development? And how do we support the infrastructure associated with that, and the enabling infrastructure to enable the investment? And there you have this question. In some cases, we might have to do a grid, not renewable, or might have to do a backup gas generator so it doesn't fail in cases of crisis.
You and I have appeared on panels talking about the bankable projects challenge, that we all want to get more sustainable finance into emerging markets where the need for assistance is greater. But if the projects aren't there, there's a big problem. And you've given a very good overview there of how that problem could be tackled.
And I think one thing is the level of data that we have in emerging markets is much less than it is in Western Europe. So therefore, that decision making on a sustainable investment is harder to do in emerging markets by default than it is in more developed economies. And this is where, as you know, I'm a great supporter of the CSRD and the development of reporting standards to ensure that there is data, there's information to enable that investment to happen.
Can I ask you about heavy industry and those high emissions companies? You talked about it in your very first answer. I think you were the sectoral lead for that sector in the EBRD. We had a whole podcast on that last year, where essentially the companies were saying to us it's an issue of cost, and that they just can't afford to do what they know and could do in order to promote the energy transition. I just wanted to ask you, how do you respond when you hear companies saying that?
This is a true factor. Cost of energy is a huge issue of being competitive. But at the same time, without the transition and going into certain supplies on renewables, we will lose the competitiveness. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg of which goes first and when. So I think particularly in Europe, we have this challenge of how we decarbonize and how we make our industry competitive. And with gas prices as they are, we have seen a big reduction of industrial output. So the question is, how do we get those two areas to finance and support? So supporting modern technologies, supporting that transition, that new technologies are developed, and looking at the cheapest form of financing for those. And of course, hopefully we can be part of that solution together with our, you could say, sister organization like European Investment Bank and others in Europe to help develop. But ultimately, the cost of energy is a key issue. So in the countries where energy is expensive, it's going to be harder to do than in other countries. But it is making sure that the incentives into doing that both institutional strengthening, the dialogue with the regulators, and presenting the best options to give that, you could say, reasonable approach for industry to transform and to develop and modernize. And without that modernization, we'll be left behind. So this is, I think, something where we are definitely looking at. We're working very closely, for instance, with Responsible Steel to look at the steel side as the bank, or the cement. There's a new glass initiative as well in terms of sustainable glass. So there are areas of coming in on the industry side, and it's very linked much to the energy side. In terms of making sure that that transition happens and we have a stable, competitive energy price. But that also with geopolitics, of course, is something outside our control.
I think that is fair to say. And I've, of course, got to ask you hard questions, that I'm a big supporter of your work. Bankwatch, which obviously exists to criticise the development banks, they looked at your first impact report. Congratulations, by the way, on doing an impact report. That's a first for any development bank. But they said too much of the information was clients supplying it to you, and that they didn't feel that you were close enough to the voice of the beneficiaries, the workers on the ground, the communities affected. And of course, that's a general problem. You and your colleagues are sitting evaluating projects over a very wide geographic area. How can you deal with the challenge that, certainly for the business and human rights space, that consultation, involvement with local stakeholders is a crucial part of what you should be doing? How do you respond to both that criticism and that challenge?
So first of all, the work of CSOs such as Bankwatch and others is very crucial to the work we do, because they do actually have people on the ground that can raise issues, and it's an important aspect which we, you could say, cherish the relationships, although sometimes might not agree with the findings, but that is a key area. We do work with major organizations, be it with BirdLife, be it with Bankwatch, on projects on trying to resolve what's called disputes or issues. And it's a very important area that comes in terms of those, you can say that independent review. So we have a small team, we do the due diligence, we follow the procedures that we have, and we believe that we have quite a thorough and robust approach to the project appraisal system. We have engagement and classification of higher risk, lower risk projects in terms of the consultation, ensuring that we go often beyond what is required by, for instance, EU law. So even in the EU, we quite often require a lot more than EU or even the IB would require on projects in terms of consultations, in terms of discussions, which does actually put us sometimes at a, you could say, less favorable view. But I think that engagement strengthens projects, and good stakeholder engagement strengthens projects in terms of ensuring that issues are addressed and there is that social license that is agreed upon to operate, and the investments are done in the right spirit. There will always be areas where some people will object. In a democratic society, there will be always, even, we have some people love wind farms, some people hate them. There will always be people opposed. There will always be something that somebody will say that could be done better. We have to balance that in that transition and in that approach between what is feasible, what is doable. And if we did just do for the best projects, we would reduce our project investments by a tenfold and do only a very few projects, and therefore stop that overall transition. This is something where I would say when we're working with, for instance, some of the ornithological societies, and BirdLife International being the biggest, of course, one of the biggest NGOs, we always do look at this issue of, okay, how do we safeguard overall protection of migratory species, to how we actually do the development of renewable projects, how we present best technologies in terms of shutdown on demand and systems. And do we sometimes get it wrong? Yes. And that is natural human question. And that's why we have the entire recourse mechanism. We can learn the lessons and look at how to manage that. So this is, I think, a key issue, is how our policies have evolved, how our requirements evolve, and be the supply chains, be contractor management. As we get bigger projects, bigger issues, the contractor management becomes, and human rights and those becomes even more important. We're putting a lot of emphasis on that. In terms of bird protection, I mean, there was, if we look at it, when I looked at in 2008, people were looking, wind farms have no impact, let's do them. And they should be categorized C, in fact, I think I had somebody say that. And they should be just helped to develop. But no, these can be A category, high risk projects that need consultation, need to have the environmental safeguards built in, including reduction of operations, which is a financial issue for the investors, to safeguard, for instance, biodiversity. In terms of land acquisition, how that goes in as well. So I would say that it would be nice to have more resources. It would be nice to do even more monitoring and approach. We are trying to do that and approach that. But it is, at the end of the day, we need to be also, we could say, that commercial side, not fully commercial, but at making sure it's a cost-effective approach. We have a risk-based approach. Our policy and new policy actually even emphasizes that more. It doesn't say specifically materiality, but in essence, that is what we're trying to do to ensure that we have the right approach. Of course, human life has no material issue. It is human life is 1-0. We should make sure that human rights are always protected, irrespective where they are. And the same in terms of biodiversity, ensuring that we do not only do no significant damage, but actually we look at how to improve the situation. So this issue of criticism, you can always criticize, you can always find a flaw, but I think overall, and my experience has been also working with Bankwatch on some projects, we can come to mutual support, particularly on biodiversity, and looking at longer term solutions. We have had projects where I think we've come to agreements. There are some projects where it's going to be hard. That's the nature of the project. We have said it from the day one. And the main issue for us is to ensure that we disclose information that is meaningful and outlines both the benefits and the risks of a project, and that our shareholders and of course the stakeholders can comment on those, particularly the high risk, of saying, well, is this the right project to do for us or not? And if we are able to do that in a transparent manner, that's good. And in terms of our reporting, we are going right now in the IFRS reporting. That's the first step. Maybe not the CSRD, but IFRS is already moving in the right direction. We're looking at strengthening that monitoring issue. And of course, we rely on data provided by clients. Self-assessment is an essential. But we do monitoring. We do visits post investment. We're increasing that role as well within our department and within the bank. And we're looking at how to, of course, both the lessons and ensure that projects are dealt with. We have, and I can't say which ones, but we have pulled the plug on some projects where their implementation has not happened. We have had our senior management, and I have to say our senior management is very supportive of the ENS issues overall. And that's, you could say that's a privilege of working in an institution where it is, and the sustainability and the concepts of human rights is embedded throughout the organization. So our work is easier than in some other institutions because we have that broad support and understanding, although it isn't always easy, is ensuring that when needed, our senior management has gone out to speak to clients to look at and how to bring in. And in most cases, this is common sense. It's basic issues. You explain it in the right way in terms of environmental, in terms of human rights, in terms of even cybersecurity. Clients will see the logic, see the benefit of it in terms of long term, and also their value at the end of the day. Projects are developed and then sold. You don't want to have a project which has fundamental problems with it being in the future in 10, 20 years time, being divested in your portfolio.
It's a fascinating discussion, but I must try to get on. You talked about your support for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, and the European Agenda on Sustainability Disclosure. But of course, we've seen some retrenchment and pushback from some of the member state governments in the EU. And your shareholders are precisely those governments. They're more than those governments. But are you finding that there's some pushback in the EBRD yet? Are you under political pressure at all in the same way that the EU has been?
It is a question which I might have to again sort of push the ball back. In some ways, it's as they say above my pay grade. But there is two issues to bear in. I think in our shareholders, irrespective of who the shareholders are, and we have a very broad shareholder, there is a general acceptance of sustainability issues, and our policy, which was approved last year, was unanimously approved by all shareholders. So there is that concept of the policy on the project levels we apply. In terms of when we are in the EU, and in the EU, we will apply EU standards and members, and therefore the EU CSRD, as it's being, for instance, implemented in the EU, will apply that in the terms of ensuring that the companies we invest are compliant with the legislation and requirements. Where we can, we of course bring in best practice, and we have been bringing in some of this best practice of companies and on our websites, which have actually developed some of the reporting requirements going beyond what is legislative requirement as part of their best practice. And many companies, particularly those that do want to be leading international companies or looking at international finance, will implement these requirements. In many cases, this is not an extra cost. If you have a good environmental and social management system, you have a good governance system, therefore the ESG is already embedded in your system, you're looking at sustainability, adding some issues in terms of reporting is not a problem wherever you are in the EU or outside. And I think there is just this politicization sometimes that's come in, that's a separate issue. We do require monitoring, and therefore on some projects, if we can align that reporting with our monitoring requirements, it reduces the burden, because companies we invest in have to, as you said, self-declare, provide information and audits, and therefore this issue will be an important area. And I think this is coming in the finance sector, not only IFIs, but also generally will be able to help in that the monitoring and having verified audits data will become the norm. And it will be, particularly if we look at the Chinese standard with double materiality coming in on reporting, the EU having its requirements, IFRS in Europe, Turkey's implementing IFRS. So the issues I think are going to come in stronger. We're helping in, for instance, Turkey with IFRS. And as we do that, we are, of course, discussing double materiality because it does make sense in terms of reputational.
On IFRS, and by the way, it's the global standards, both for financial and non-financial reporting. And I say that for our audience because there are always new people coming in and listening. But one question I can put to you, which is definitely not above your pay grade, is that you've been actually part of expert groups that have developed some of the European sustainability reporting standards. So you've been very close to be what's happening in Europe on disclosure, but you're also part of the technical review group for IFRS, for the International Sustainability Standards. So you've had a first-hand close watch at both. How do you compare both, and what would you say to our audience in business about that?
Okay, so first of all, that is, you could say, I do that on top of my work, and I'm an independent expert in both, not representing the bank. So that I think is, but of course, associated with bank and supported by the bank on being able to have this independent view in these two approaches. So we have, and I think my task has always been to try to bring the IFI requirements as closely aligned when the ESRSs are being developed, or now on the IFRS requirements. I work with some of our colleagues who are also involved with, for instance, IFRS on S2. We're looking at, of course, how will the TNFD, we've got colleagues working and assisting on that side and including some pilot projects. On the ESRSs, we have, of course, helped with developing ESG guidance for reporting in Poland and Czech Republic and Romania. We'll have to update some of those as, of course, the ESRSs are being amended now, and you could say a more robust version being put forward through political pressures, but also I think there was a need to maybe try to simplify some issues, and I think we support the simplifications. And ultimately, a lot of the requirements, and also when I look at the taxonomy, which the bank has been involved in, as well as an observer and supporting that work, a lot of the requirements of do no significant harm, or looking at disclosing of information, looking at social issues, are what we are in our policies. They're very, very much similar. But we did a project, this is corporate. We have 10 environment and social requirements, which include environment and social, which are actually quite aligned in some of the requirements of the ESRSs under the CSRD. Now, the reporting, and I think the similarity is that we have the reporting requirement, we have a pre-investment requirement, but actually both for the reporting and for our requirements, you need to have the management system in place to manage that risk and manage those issues and provide information. And that's where the big overlap is between those requirements. And in that role that I have been able to do, I've been trying to, of course, sometimes more success, sometimes less, is to align those two requirements. That it's the most important is that there is a risk management system which enables, for me, from a risk perspective, before I invest, understand you are managing your risk, so for the data that comes out is useful. And of course, the data reporting and the verification for legislative issues and compliance issues relies on that management system, which is a robust management system to assess those risks. So ultimately, we want the companies to be able to, and that even goes back to your first question, can we rely on questions that companies provide? We will have to rely on that in the same way we rely for financial information on audited financial statements. We will have to rely on those management systems that they rely and provide information to the external world, but also to the financial world, and that it is a robust management system that we can trust. And that trust, of course, needs some verification of that system and therefore the audits. But ultimately, that the company is able to assess its risk. And for a company internally, they need to assess their risk because it is as well a fundamental long-term approach. Do I understand the risks in the changing world, be it supply chain? So currently, where's my oil coming through? Is it going to come in or not because of the supply chains? And each country produces different crude, which might need a different refinery and therefore a different approach as well. Just talking about what's happening right now. But if I look at the supply chains, am I actually relying on just one manufacturer? Can I diversify? What will happen if there is, in terms of flooding or fires? Will that impact my supply chains? Never mind wars or sanctions. So a company needs to look at its entire reputational impact of where it supply chains, how it produces, the cost of energy is so important in terms of my future development. If energy is a key component, how do I diversify? How do I look at those efficiencies or look at alternatives? My circularity, how do I actually reduce the reliance on earth metals, which if we look at some of the heavy metals, copper or gold going up, if I rely on that, if I can recirculate or reuse it, is that's going to put me in a competitive bid because of the prices on the competitive markets going in of those raw materials. So I think that this area is a very important side of where we're coming in terms of managing risk, managing my resources, where we go. And as an IFI, we're trying to, of course, develop and bring those companies in line. We're going to be doing more and more corporate work. So in the past, we did a lot of project finance, which you'd have the standards for a project as you finance the project. As we go into more and more bond markets, capital markets, as we do more of the corporate issues, the more we will need to rely on reasonable standards and the self-declarations. And of course, this is where be it CSRD or IFRS will come in on the worldwide scheme of relying whether I put the capital there. And that, I think, is going to be a key issue, not only for IFIs, but also pension funds and other investors, of whether the data is there, whether I can rely on information. And this is, I think, some of the misunderstandings that have happened, unfortunately, in the debates recently in the EU Parliament as well, in my view, is that people don't understand that if there isn't data in Eastern Europe, I might not be able to make those investments because it would be easier for me to make investments in countries where the data is already there, but might be labeled in a different way because the tradition has been. And speaking to a colleague from Bloomberg, and officially there, basically said, actually American firms disclose a lot more information. than the European counterparts already. So that level of data that there is in terms of the SEC requirements of data that's gone in and how it is verified is just labeled differently. And it's looked at in the risk management areas and for financial disclosures as well.
It's a very clear answer that I think has echoed some of our other guests on Frankly Speaking, that not just regulators but investors want the data. And I think you've evidenced that very well. We're nearly out of time, but I want to ask you one final question. You're in the banking sector, you're a special type of bank, but you're in the banking sector, and you've seen recently the Net Zero Banking Alliance stop and collapse. How do you respond to that?
Again, probably be not my area of where I on a day-to-day basis. But it is a sign of the times of certainly moving away. But there's a two-edge. I think it's half full, half empty. I think there have been, and this is sort of not an EBRD statement, it's my personal statement. I think there has been a lot of companies that have jumped on the bandwagon without understanding what it means. And it's a nice marketing. We'll have net zero, net this, and everything else. And in reality, that net zero is going to be hard to attain or not feasible in that period of time. And of course, once the crunches come in, and then there's the geopolitical, people move away. Now we need that transition, and I think the key issue for us is to work on the transition, helping both banks to develop transitions, maybe, this net zero, not achieving net zero per se, but helping to reduce those levels that are also from a competitive point of view, because emissions is used energy, it's wasted energy quite often. That's why we have those emissions. If we can reduce them and we can be more competitive using the resources that we have, then overall we will reach that. And from a banking point of view, that's a long-term investment. If we are looking at the stress testing and looking at investments, it's obvious that if something is highly emitting and doesn't have a policy, it does not understand the company, understand its you could say impact and reputational impact, long-term future, then does it have a long-term future? Versus a company that understands and is planning for the various eventualities, including changes in costs of not only carbon, but also fuel in terms of resources, and therefore being able to flexibly manage because they understand what they stand on. And that, I think, is going to be a critical issue going forward. But I think there will be a lot of consolidation. I do hope that IFRS adopts double materiality and there's a bit more cooperation. I do see that the voluntary ESRSs will be used, and I think many companies will do that, irrespective of what the legislation is. I think the financial sector will require that in some of their investments. And monitoring reporting is something that in a transparency and in a democratic world we need to enable us to be able to judge whether those certain declarations, including ours, are being met and that we are actually fulfilling them. We believe we are, and EBRD is, I think, on the good side of the spectrum. We want to maintain that, but that means that we need to continue doing our work in terms of the due diligence assessment and reporting, and having the support of CSOs, understanding also sometimes our shortcomings.
It's been a fascinating discussion, Robert. We've heard about EBRD's work on projects and the best available techniques, which I think we've not covered before, and frankly speaking, so really interesting insight there. You've responded to the challenges that come not just from us, but more widely on the amount of investment still going into fossil fuels, partly by saying sometimes there's no alternative, and you cited the example of Ukraine, but also you cited where in Poland you've been very much part of pressing for the transition. We talked about the ongoing challenges of heavy industries being able to be involved in the energy transition and the work the banks that's doing there. You actually welcome the criticism that comes from civil society organisations like Bankwatch, and you see that as part of a democratic way of being able to be open to criticism and to complaints. And you've also said how EBRD is increasing its local monitoring further. We talked about whether there was enough money overall, and you made the point that we need bankable projects where they are needed, and what the bank, your bank, EBRD, is doing in order to enable those bankable projects to exist. And then we finished with a discussion about the European agenda. You made an important point to our business listeners about the management systems they use in order to be able to assess and manage sustainability risks, and also on the need for data, saying that American companies provide more data than European ones. That's a great comment, but how you also hope that the global sustainability standards, IFRS, will move to double materiality. On the collapse of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, you said emissions are about wasted energy, and perhaps efficiency is the argument that should be brought to the fore there. A fascinating discussion. Robert, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And I do hope the sustainability continues and that the EBRD and what we do together is going to be part of the solution. I do hope that best practices are employed, including the ESRSs, some of which are voluntary, I think will become a standard, because I'm a great believer on that in my private capacity as well. But as a bank, we, of course, will follow best practices that we have. And it is important to know that there is no such thing as perfection, but we are striving to do that transition in the best way. And that means it is a journey. And I think the bank EBRD has been a good place that has been driving that transition, that journey, which is continuing and will continue for many years.
Thank you again. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. Don't forget, you can now watch the Frankly Speaking podcast on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Robert Adamczyk of the EBRD, and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.